Streaming? Okay. How's everyone this morning? How are you guys? For, no internet at were you camping or at your place? What happened? Huh? Oh, well, that's a bummer. When that happens in the future, let me know. You can come in here and use the Wi-Fi. This whole big hall just sits there empty all week. And we do have some people who come in and stream the show because they don't have very fast internet at home. There's a ginormous TV in there. You can pop your own popcorn in the kitchen. Works well. Well, that's frustrating. So you didn't get to watch this episode? Okay. All right. Well, I'll get. Right. It's been a while. Yeah. Josh and Sarah, how are you guys? You're good? Good to see you guys. Dave and Sandy. Boy, this sun coming in through the windows, it's pretty, but it blinds me. Yeah. You guys are fine? You guys are fine too? Yeah. Okay. Scott, I do have some apple cider for you to deliver when you go. Even if you just get it the Good Shepherd, that's fine. Yeah. About halfway there, I remembered I was going to bring some and didn't. So, Vicki, how are you? You're good? Pam, what are you doing hanging out back there? I know you're going. She's betraying me. She's going to worship. She's going to listen to another man preach. I'm not sure what I think of that. Oh, that's right. That's right. The Kettle kids are singing over at Peace this morning. So it's a Kettle Moraine Sunday. So the first one of the season. So I technically could have maybe made it. I'd never get to see them, of course. Being a pastor, I'm kind of busy on Sunday mornings. But they do have a 7:30 a.m. service at Peace. But I had too much work to do this morning to give up that time slot. So that just wasn't going to work out. So I don't have yet to see my children sing in a church. Live stream, I can do it, but just one of those things as a pastor, there's a couple of time slots every week that you have zero flexibility on. You have a lot of flexibility the rest of the time, which is great. But there are some times where it's really hard to get away. But good to have you guys here. We are in season 4, episode 6, I'm sorry. And I tried to actually listen to this episode on my way across the great state of Minnesota. And I listened to about the first half of the episode and figured, this isn't working for me. I need to see it too. So we paused it and I watched it when I got back. So the first half, I heard, but I did not see. The second half, I both watched and saw. So we are getting closer, right? We are getting closer to Jesus' death and crucifixion in Jerusalem, and the disciples are getting very nervous, knowing they can see the writing on the wall, right? They know what's about to happen. The episode starts out about the first half, actually, by telling a story that every Jewish person would know, but that a lot of Christians don't know, although we should know it, because it helps us to understand the background of what's going on at the time of Jesus. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that story, and then we're going to spend some time reading John chapter 10, because that features heavily in this episode. So, what do you know about the festival of Hanukkah? Kind of interesting, right? We know our own tradition. We know what Christmas is all about. But even though Christianity came out of Judaism, we don't know much about Judaism. But that's one thing I've appreciated about The Chosen, is that it does tend to start out with a Jewish festival or highlight some part of Judaism and then kind of segue into Jesus. And so I appreciated the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So what do you know about Hanukkah? There's got to be at least one thing you know about Hanukkah. It's the Festival of Lights, okay? They sing songs. It's 8 days long. Yep, okay. Well, you did know some stuff about Hanukkah. See, I knew you did. What else do you know about Hanukkah? Yes, there's a candle involved. It's near Christmas time. Yep. Okay, near captivity time. We'll get into that in a minute. There are some more crossovers between Christmas and Hanukkah. So we talked about how it's a festival of lights, and of course, Christmas lights are a big part of how we celebrate Christmas. What's another thing that we do at Christmas that they also do at Hanukkah? What? Gifts, presents. Yeah, there's a gift exchange that takes place. And in fact, Christmas, at least it depends upon everybody's family's individual traditions, but some people have one day of gift giving during the Christmas season, and others spread it around a little bit. If you're going to grandma's house on a different day, maybe you open some presents there, and then the other grandma on a different day, you open some presents there, and then you open some presents with your immediate family, maybe on Christmas morning. But in the season of Hanukkah, the Jewish people give gifts to each other each day of Hanukkah. So it's 8 days long. There are typically 8 smaller gifts exchanged during the season of Hanukkah. So similar but different. What else do you know about Hanukkah? I don't even know how to do it. H-A-N. Nope, don't know how to do it. That's what spell checker's for. What else? So the show, I think, does an okay job of kind of telling you the story of how Hanukkah came about. So it goes back, they take the show, in the show, they go back to Alexander the Great. What do you know about Alexander the Great? And in the show, they call him Alexander the Horrible or something like that. Because from the Jewish perspective, they didn't care for Alexander the Great. They disagreed with the title, the Great. What do you know about Alexander the Great from your ancient world history class back in high school, which I'm sure you didn't actually have. But I did, because you have to take that class when you want to become a pastor. Yeah. Yeah. So essentially the whole known civilized world at that point was conquered by the military commander of Greece. So the country of Greece became extremely powerful, and their armies were known around the world as formidable and absolutely unbeatable. And that's what they did. They marched around with their huge armies, and they just basically took over the world. And this all happened about 300 years before Jesus. So what would that be? In our timeline, how old is America? Let's go 1776. Let's go 1776. How old does that make us? You guys have to do math. This is too early for the pastor to do math. 250. Okay? Roughly 250 years in our past, America became a country. How much do you know about that time period in America? Some, right? some, unless that's your hobby and you do a lot of reading in that period. Now, this was 300 years before the birth of Jesus. So the Jewish people knew what happened, but it was a long time ago, right? In the same way that the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence in our country was a long time ago. 250 years seems like a long time, right? We're really a very young nation when it comes down to it. But so 300 years before the time of Jesus, there was this guy by the name of Judas Maccabeus, and he has a really cool nickname. Did anyone pick up on that from the episode? His nickname is the Hammer. Okay? Judas Maccabeus' nickname is the Hammer. Do you know what the name of the tavern is that Mary Magdalene, at the very first episode of this whole series, way back in season 1, episode 1, remember Peter and James and John, the fishermen, are hanging out in a tavern and they're drinking and they're gambling and they're being fishermen, right? And you remember the name of the tavern? It's called the Hammer. Okay, so already way back then they're trying to tie this in for the Jewish people. Judas Maccabeus is the most important figure in their recent history. They go back to the prophets, and of course David eventually, at the Davidic rule and Solomon's rule, where basically David and Solomon conquered the whole known, well, not the whole known world, but they conquered a big chunk of the land that God gave to them. And roughly how long back in history of Israel does that go? So the time of David to the time of Jesus' birth, when did David live? Anyone know on the timeline? So 1,000 years, roughly 1,000 years. So right at 1,000-year mark before Jesus is born, we've got David and Solomon, and then we have that long 300-400 period of time in the history of Israel where they had one bad king after another, and in the northern kingdom they only had bad kings, right? And in the southern kingdom they had like 4 or 5 good kings interspersed over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years. And then we had the period of the judges, and then we have the period of about 750 years or so before Jesus is born. We have the period of the deportation out of Israel, where it's called the Babylonian captivity, where the Jewish people are exported to Babylon for 70 years, and then they are allowed to come back in. And so this is all a part of the history of the Jewish people. And like I said, it's probably something we don't know as well as we should. As Christians, we should make a better effort at knowing our Bible history. I will admit, even when I was going to school, I probably didn't pay attention enough in Bible history class. As I got older, appreciated the history, understood why it mattered and how it connected to the New Testament better, and so I started paying a lot more attention to it. And it is very useful as a Christian to understand that Old Testament history. I know it's a lot of hard names, can't spell them, right? Can't pronounce them. It's countries that we've never been to, so it's kind of hard geographically to figure out where is Galilee in Israel, and where is Israel in the world, right? In the world's map, can you kind of picture where that all is? That takes a lot of time to try and absorb all of that. But anyways, we go back 300 years before, and the Greek Empire has conquered the world, and when Alexander the Great dies, he has a succession plan in place. Who's going to take over after Alexander the Great dies? He divides his kingdom into 4 parts and gives rulers, puts satraps in charge of each of the 4 parts of his kingdom. And the king, the satrap that's in charge of the part where Israel is a really, really, really bad man. Think Nero, think Adolf Hitler, think Pol Pot, think Stalin, think really wicked, evil, horrible man. Genocide, horrible ruler, merciless, brutal, and his name is Antiochus Epiphanes. I think I got that right. And he's a bad man. And he comes to power over the land that, the part of the country, the part of the world that contains Israel. And he basically rules with an iron fist. And he takes over the temple in Jerusalem. He kicks out all of the Jewish stuff that's in there, all of their altars, all of the lights and what's in the Holy of Holies. He takes it all out and he converts it into a pagan temple. And I don't know, what would that be like for us? Like, who could we think of invading our little village of Neosho and taking over our church here and converting it into what? What would that have to be for you to kind of understand it? How about this? A bunch of Satanists take over power and come in and set up, they take down the cross, they destroy all of the baptismal font and the altar and the stuff all the stuff that you love about your church, the stained glass windows, right? They take all of that stuff and they just smash it and destroy it and they burn it and then they put a big pentagram on the wall. Okay? And over here they have an altar where they kill goats and they spread the goat blood all over the church. That's basically what happened to the Jewish people in their temple. Taken over by pagan people who absolutely converted it into a pagan temple, and they couldn't do anything about it because they were militarily weak and they were not able to fight back against Antiochus and his armies. And this happens for a long time. Okay? For hundreds of years, your church is converted into a ritualistic worship place for Satan. And all of the time, you are scheming, how are we going to get it back? How are we going to take it over? Right? And you tell this story to your children. And who becomes the enemy? Of course, the Satan worshipers, right? You teach your kids, we got to get rid of these Satan worshipers. They're horrible. They've desecrated our temple. They've destroyed our place of worship. We need to get them out of power. We need to take them out. Well, how historically speaking, how has this happened? When you're the underdog, you're the occupied nation, and the big, militarily strong country is occupying. I think as Americans, we have a really easy thing to think about, right? As Americans, the British Empire. They're huge, they're massive. They have the Navy, they have the soldiers, they have what do the Americans have? Pitchforks, farmers with some squirrel guns, right? So how does America beat the biggest nation on the most powerful nation on earth? Guerrilla warfare. It's the pattern that always happened, right? So here comes this great big, well-fortified, paid for army. They've got supply chains and everything else. And they go out to war and they fight in their formations and they line up. And we Americans are standing behind trees picking them off with our squirrel guns. And they don't know how to fight like that. They're not used to that. So It's kind of like what happened in Vietnam. It's kind of like what happens as you study world history over and over and over again. Big military occupying force gets beat up by guerrilla warfare. I mean, think about what happened. I mean, America, right? We went to Afghanistan. How'd that work out for us? We're the strongest military nation on the world. We could bomb the whole of Afghanistan back into a third world country. Well, it already is a third world country. but we couldn't beat them. Why? Because they hid in the caves. Right? They wouldn't take to the field where we could destroy them with our Air Force or whatever. Okay? So that's what happens 300 years before the time of Jesus. This man by the name of Judas Maccabeus rises up and starts organizing the Jewish people into guerrilla warfare groups. Okay? And these little pockets of resistance take their pot shots at the Greek army that's occupying their nation. And slowly, over hundreds of years, they chip away and they chip away and they chip away. And eventually, under the rule of Judas Maccabeus, they actually take the temple back. They kick the Greeks out, okay? And they take all of the Greek pagan worship stuff that they had set up in the temple, and they get rid of it, and they bring back in their stuff. It'd be equivalent to us of hiring somebody to make all this furniture again, right? And we put it all back in. We get our baptismal font in. We get our pulpit in. We get our altar in. We get the candles back in. We get the banners in place, the stained glass windows in place. And now we can worship again. Okay? And that's exactly what happens 300 years before Jesus. This rebel band of soldiers, guerrilla warfares, Judas Maccabeus with his army, take the temple back. They kick out all the pagan stuff, and they set it all back up for themselves. And when they take over the temple, they find enough oil. Now, if you've read the Old Testament, you know that God has a lot of rules about what takes place in the temple. It has to be purified. It has to be ritualistically clean. You can't just use whatever you want in temple worship. Even the perfume that they used, the incense that they used, was prescribed by God. It had to be a blend, a recipe that they used that followed what God said. And so the oil that was burned in the candles in the temple was a special kind of oil, and it was purified. Okay? And so ritualistically purified. And so they found enough oil in the temple that was still clean for the candle to burn for one day. And so when they set their temple back up again, they got the candle set up, and they lit the candle, and miraculously it lasted for 8 days. Okay? And so that's why the celebration of Hanukkah is 8 days long. And that's why they light the candle. And when they give gifts to each other, they're celebrating their victory over their overlords. So for us Americans, we call this what? The 4th of July. Right? We shoot off fireworks. We get together and we have brats and hamburgers and a couple of beverages, and we celebrate the freedom that our forefathers won for us and separating us away from King George III, who was taxing us without representation. Right? So America, we understand that history. I don't know that we understand it as well as we could, but the Jewish people really understood their own history. And so every year during this season, when this Judas Maccabeus came to power and kicked out the Greeks, they celebrated this event. Now in the Chosen, I think they're not trying to get the timeline lined up. So the dedication as well as Hanukkah, they kind of blend that all together. And I think in reality, there's months that separate those two celebrations. according to the Jewish calendar, but according to the timeline of the chosen, they're trying to tell a story. So they're smushing it all together because it makes better sense from a storytelling point of view. All right, so that's Judas Maccabeus, and the people are celebrating. They're in an inn celebrating, right? And every night they're reading some of the Psalms. Did you catch that? They're reading/singing some of the Psalms. We don't always sing Psalms in church. We probably should. I don't know. I've thought about it over time, and why do you think I don't sing the Psalms very often in church? You guys who've been here forever probably maybe don't even realize that we don't use the Psalms. But maybe some of our newer members who came from other churches are like, hey, wait a minute, why don't we use the Psalms on Sunday morning? Why don't we use the Psalms on Sunday morning? You're not going to like the answer. You don't know how to sing it. Yeah, I don't know how to sing it either. Well, Karen, if you want to do a solo and teach us how to sing the Psalms, I will have to quit pointing to him. We don't know how to sing the Psalms very well. What's another reason? I get enough complaints right now that my service is too long. So you stick 6 minutes onto that baby and then watch the sparks fly, especially when the Packers play at noon. Holy cow. Something else has to go out. Okay, all right. I like some of the Psalms. Some of the Psalms we are familiar with. The new Psalter is really good. We haven't bought the new hymnals either, but the new Psalter has all 150 Psalms. Here's the reality. We do not have the musical gifts that St. Paul's Neo should have do it. If we were to sing the Psalms and sing them well, what would need to happen? We would need cantors. And who is supposed to arrange for the cantors? Who has to call the cantor and make sure the cantor is actually going to show up? Who has to make sure that the cantor has time to practice with the organist ahead of time? I'm saying it's a lot of work to make it happen. That's what I'm saying. Right? It's not just as simple as throwing a psalm in there. If we're going to do it right. Now, I am willing to do it. If there was anyone in our congregation that said, you know what, I really miss the Psalms, and I think we should be singing more of them, can I take that on as my own project for getting that back into our worship? At that point, I would be willing to find the 6 minutes. Right? What our practice was before was to sing the Psalms on non-communion services. That kind of eventually went away. That 6 minutes is available on non-communion Sundays. It's harder to find that 6 minutes when we're serving communion. But anyway, the Psalms play a big role in this episode where the disciples are singing and chanting the Psalms around the table with Jesus. The Psalms are the hymn book of the Old Testament. And I love the Psalms, personally. I love reading the Psalms. I love meditating on the Psalms. I've always loved the Psalms. Even I remember when I was a high school student, I probably didn't read a lot of the Bible myself on my own. I probably should have, but I wasn't. But one of the sections of the Bible that I did read on a regular basis was the Psalms. I'm having the kids read the Psalms in catechism class. Last week, they asked me, Pastor, why do you have us read the Psalms? They asked me that. Well, we don't have enough time in class for me to explain to you why you're reading the Psalms. Here's the deal, kid. Just read the Psalms. They're good for you, right? Yeah. Do you explain to your kids on a microbiology level why they should eat broccoli? Well, the green stuff in there, you need that for this part of your body to function. No, you don't. You say, just eat the broccoli, right? So I said to the kids, just read the Psalms. Right, Colton?
Yeah.
Was that you that asked?
No, I was.
I didn't think it was. We're reading the Gospel of Matthew right now and the Psalms. And they get why we're reading the Gospels, right? But they didn't understand when we're reading the Psalms. And I said, well, I hope just keep reading them, and I hope you'll figure it out on your own. Right? I hope you'll understand why we're reading the Psalms. By reading the Psalms, you'll understand how they function, what they serve. But I did appreciate that in this episode, how the Psalms work. Like I said, I do feel somewhat badly about not using the Psalms in our worship service. I just wish we had additional music gifts. We just don't have them. And so you have to play with the cards you're dealt. Some churches have 4 aces, and it's just not fair. And some churches have a 2 and 3 offsuit. That's our pocket. Scott? Yeah.
I don't recall, I'm not coming up anywhere in the Gospels, the only book of the past.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking maybe it's because it's more of a civic ceremony.
They called it the Feast of Dedication. Yeah, so they're rededicating the temple. So you probably did read that, but you didn't know that was the equivalent of Hanukkah. Yeah. Hanukkah, the name Hanukkah, I didn't look that up, but that's probably there's a more recent usage for that term Hanukkah for the Feast of the Dedication. But in the Bible, it's called the Feast of the Dedication. And Jesus definitely observes it with his disciples. And again, they're rededicating the temple after it was desecrated for all of those years. Yeah, that's a good point. John chapter 10. Open up your Bibles. So again, let me just back up a little bit. So Judas Maccabeus comes and kicks out the successor of the Greeks. Now Jesus comes, and who's occupying Jerusalem, and who is dictating what happens in the temple in Jerusalem, right? It's a different empire. The next empire that came to power after the Greeks was the Romans, of course. And the Romans basically took over the same way the Greeks did, with pure military might and power. Nobody could beat the Roman armies. And so they just marched around and defeated all of their enemies, right? So the Romans went up to Gaul, which is what? Modern day France, beat all the French. The Romans went over to England. What'd they do over there? They beat all the English. They went up to there was no Germany at the time, but there was a Germanic tribe that lived up in roughly Germany area of Europe. What did the Romans do? Same thing they always did. They went in and destroyed the Germans. They destroyed the French. They destroyed the English. They took over the whole known world, including Israel. And that's why Pontius Pilate is down there. He is ruling for the Roman emperor back in Rome. And he is sending taxes back to the city of Rome. And he is supporting Rome's move to basically conquer the entire known world. And so now the Romans are in charge of Jerusalem as the occupying force. And they do give the Jews more power than the Greeks did, right? So the Romans were better about this. The Romans were like, okay, let's not take away their religion, because we've noticed that when we do that, what happens? They rise up and rebel against us, right? And even the might of the Roman army can't withstand the guerrilla warfare. So the Romans figure this out. We can't go down the same path that everybody else went down and get ourselves in trouble with the guerrilla warfare, because even our best trained armies aren't going to be able to win. And so they basically said, well, what ticks them off the most? What ticks them off the most is when we take their religion away from them. So we'll give them a religion. So the Romans let the Jews have the temple and worship. They controlled it, but they allowed them to do what they wanted to do. And so this is kind of where things are at. Now Jesus comes, and what do you think everyone is thinking? Well, Jesus is going to be the next Judas Maccabeus, right? He's gathering forces, he's gathering disciples, he's gathering followers. So now Jesus, there are a lot of people who are thinking that Jesus is going to be the next Judas Maccabeus and is going to do what Judas Maccabeus did to the Greeks, Jesus is going to do to the Romans. So you can see why so many people misunderstood Jesus' mission. Jesus' mission wasn't to win a military, prize, a kingdom. He said, my kingdom is not of this world, right? That's what he told Pilate. Pilate could only think of military kingdoms and politics, earthly politics. And Jesus is like, I'm not thinking about that. My kingdom is not of this world. I'm not interested in raising an army. I'm not interested in military. I'm not interested in guerrilla warfare. What did Jesus, in fact, tell his disciples instead? When someone slaps you on the cheek, turn to him the other as well. Does that sound like guerrilla warfare? Does that sound like somebody the Romans need to be worried about from a military standpoint? Jesus said, if soldiers make you walk 1 mile, you walk 2 miles. Does this sound like a rebel who's going to cause problems to Rome? No, he's not. And Pilate does get this, right? Pilate eventually says, there is no basis for a charge against this man. Pilate begins, even as a Roman governor, he understands that Jesus and what he's doing, that's a religious thing. It's not a political thing. Of course, the Jews wanted Pilate to think it was a political thing, right? What did they say to Pilate? They said, this man claims to be the king of the Jews. And so they wanted to make Jesus a political figure. Jesus wasn't a political figure. Jesus was a religious figure. And so you can see some of the confusion that happens at the time of Jesus, where some people are seeing Jesus gather these crowds. Great crowds of people are following Jesus. Thousands of people. I mean, you think about Jesus fed the 5,000. Well, we know there was a lot more than 5,000 there that day because of the men and women and children, right? So we're talking 20, 30,000 people following Jesus. And some people are going, oh, this is the start, right? He's going to tell them to go home and get those pitchforks and start stabbing the Roman soldiers when they're sleeping. We're going to start this guerrilla warfare, right? And of course, that's not what happens, ultimately. Bailey, I'm going to wrap this up so that you can practice a little and we can end the live stream. I didn't get to John chapter 10, but that's where I want to take you. So just on your own, read John chapter 10 this week, because this is basically the second half of episode 6, where Jesus is basically walking through this whole scenario where Jesus and his flock, and he is talking about the religious leaders of his day, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he's basically saying these are like hired shepherds. They don't really care for the sheep, so when danger comes, they run away. And then he talks about he starts talking about himself in very bold terms, about that I and the Father are one, Jesus says. Okay? And the Jewish leaders that are there in the temple and hear Jesus make this claim, I and the Father are one, they pick up on that and they go, wait a second. Jesus, you're claiming to be like the Son of God? And they're like, that's blasphemy. You can't say that. Right? You can't say that. Of course, Jesus can say it because he is the Son of God. But their hearts are hard. They're not willing to accept the fact that Jesus is the Son of God. And Jesus basically says, well, what do my works say to you? All of these miracles that I've done, all of these things that I've accomplished, what do they say to you? Right? I mean, who else can make the blind see? Who else can make the leper whole? Who else can give speech to somebody who was born mute and dumb? Who else can feed the 5,000 and so on and so forth? And so Jesus is basically saying, look at what I've done. What I've done is what the Messiah came to do. I am not evil, I am good. And it doesn't matter, because when he claimed to be God, they picked up stones and they attempted to stone him. And the text tells us that Jesus and the disciples kind of escaped through the crowd. In the show, in The Chosen, they add some stuff in there. Of course, that's not scriptural. It's fiction. It's made up. Where the disciples and Jesus take some stones to the head, right? And in the show, they have, I think it's James the Greater gets hit in the head with a stone and starts bleeding, and they haul him out of the temple. And there's all of that takes place. That is not scriptural. That is the storytelling. That is The Chosen telling the story. Yeah.
Verse 22, if I just read the footnotes, I would see that the feast of dedication footnote says that is Hanukkah.
That's okay. I forgive you, Scott, for not reading the footnotes. Yeah. I'm guessing that term Hanukkah came much later. And so we're used to the term, but they wouldn't have even used it at the time of Jesus. I don't know what the history of why we started, or the Jewish people started using that term. That I don't understand. All right, let's close with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for being the good shepherd of the sheep, not like hired hand. You did not run away when your life was in danger, but instead you actually ran to the cross to pay for the lives of the sheep and to pay for us. We thank you for your dedication to us and your love for us. We ask that that you would help us to trust in you and to worship you with all of our hearts, souls, and minds. We pray this in